Hello and welcome to your workshop on how to cut and install baseboards. I'm Mike and I'm joined by Ron, and together we'll walk you through the steps involved in both removing and replacing old baseboards. It's a project that just about any DIYer can take on.
So here's the rundown of what we'll be covering in today's workshop. Measuring and planning, preparing the work area, removing those old baseboards, planning for your cuts, cutting, installing, and the final touches in order to make that room pop.
Now let's focus a little bit right here at the beginning on measuring and purchasing your baseboards. The first thing you'll need to do is measure each wall and section of wall where the baseboards will be installed, including closets. This will give you the total length you will need to cover with your new baseboards. Basic baseboards are usually sold in 16-foot lengths. So give some thought to not only how many individual baseboards you're going to need for your project, but also how they'll be divided up throughout the room.
For example, here's a diagram of the room we'll be working on in this workshop.
So Ron, looking at this room, if you walked into this room, how would you go about planning out the whole baseboard project?
Well, the first thing that I would do is I would take a look at the entire room. I'd choose my largest walls first, and chances are, if it's not bigger than 16 foot, you can get away with one run of 16-foot baseboard. And then I work my way around the room, and that's how I would choose the baseboard as far as the total amounts needed.
So looking at this room, based on the math that we've done, we've decided we're going to need 5 16-foot baseboards. So look at the left wall. The left wall is 15 foot, 8.5 inches. That's obviously just shy of 16 feet, so you can plan to just put one piece of baseboard on that wall. Looking at the back wall, it's 14 foot, 8 inches. So that's a little over a foot and 4 inches
Right.
shy of 16. So that would be another 16-foot baseboard with a little bit left over that you could plan to use somewhere else. You look at the right wall, it's 14 foot, 8 inches as well. So you're going to end up with that same little leftover piece. So for those 3 walls, you would need 3 different pieces of baseboard. The parts that are left over, you could plan to use those parts somewhere else in the room. So look in the closet. There are 2 8.5-inch pieces. So those foot and 4-inch pieces would cover that. But if you're looking at this room, just like I did the first time I looked at this, I thought, well, that's probably 3 pieces. All of those smaller walls, that's probably another piece of baseboard. But it's not. If you do the actual math and you add that up, it actually comes out to 246 inches. That works out to be 20 feet and 6 inches. So one piece of 16-foot baseboard is not going to cover that. Even if you take those 2 little pieces and take away those 8.5 inches, that's still going to leave around 18 feet of wall that you've got to cover. So that means we're going to need 2 additional pieces for that section of the room. So all told, again, 3 for the larger walls and 2 for the closet and the areas outside the closet. So all told, that's 5 pieces of 16-foot baseboard.
So Mike, you also need to consider that if you're new to, cutting and using a miter saw, you might want to get extra baseboard just so that you can make practice cuts and get familiar with it, because mistakes are going to happen and you need to recognize that and plan for it. So usually you want to get about 10% more than what you think you're going to need.
Right, and think about this. Again, in our case, we're going to end up with so much extra. We're going to have more than 10% extra. So if your overall measurements come in significantly lower than what you have to purchase, you don't necessarily have to worry about the 10%. You've already got that. But if your total, when you add it up, if it's really close to whatever the amount of baseboard is you think you're going to buy, if those totals are pretty similar, that's when you want to go ahead and plan to get a little bit of extra. So it depends on how it works out. In our case, we've already got 10% extra. If that's not the case for you, plan to purchase that because it's really important. Now, another thing to think about, leftover baseboard can be returned. Just check with your store for details on the specifics of that. but it's also a good idea just to keep some scraps on hand anyway. There's no guarantee that the exact baseboard that you're installing is going to be available several years from now, the next time you need to replace some baseboards. So those extra pieces left over after the installation can be used when you're doing repairs in the future. So another reason to have a little bit of extra on hand. Even if you don't use it, keep it in case you need it in the future.
So now you know what you need. Now it's time to shop for it. So consider choosing baseboards that are taller than the ones you're replacing. This will ensure that you're able to cover any slight damage that may occur from removing those old baseboards. In addition, bigger baseboards are going to make for more wow factor and give you more pop in that room.
Yeah, especially like in our case, we had really small baseboards in place that we were replacing with larger ones. So, the bigger the baseboard, the bigger you're going to notice it, the more of an impact it's going to have on the overall look of the room. So something to think about. Next, you'll want to prepare the area that you'll be working in. You want to clear the area around the walls. Remove any furniture or obstacles near the baseboards to provide you clear access, especially things like beds, dressers, any furniture or tables. Now, depending on the size of your room, you may be able to get away with just moving everything to the center of the room. However, considering that you'll be maneuvering long pieces of baseboard around the room, you'll save yourself a lot of frustration by just going ahead and moving everything completely out of the room. Anytime you save on the front end by not doing that, you're going to waste it later when you're constantly trying to work around things, move stuff out of your way, or just step over things. Trust us, it's worth the time at the beginning of your project just to move everything out.
So now consider laying down drop cloths or some kind of drop plastic in order to protect the floor. And here's a quick tip for you. You can actually stuff the drop cloth up under the baseboard while you're removing it. That way it'll keep the floors nice. Also on the back end, you can put that drop cloth back down after you get the new ones installed, Mike, because that will keep it nice and clean for whenever you're actually doing any kind of touch-up painting or painting them.
Right, and just think, you can use drop cloths throughout this process. You can have it there while you're removing it because there's going to be pieces of old caulk that come out. If you scrape off some of the adhesive that maybe is behind there, those little chunks might fall down. Those are going to be there. And then when you install the new one and start to do your touch-ups, you're going to have other issues. So again, you can put them down throughout the process. You may have to remove them, or they may work loose when you're taking the baseboards off. They may get in the way when you're putting the new ones on. You may want to move them temporarily, maybe put them back, but just know drop cloths throughout this process can help you not only protect the floor that's underneath it, but also speed up cleanup, because all that stuff you're going to eventually have to clean up anyway. Most of it's going to end up on the drop cloth. Make it a little bit easier to get that out of there when you're done. Now, to remove your old baseboards, you'll first gather the necessary tools and materials: a pry bar or molding removal tool, a putty knife, a hammer, a utility knife, and a small block of wood.
So use a utility knife to score the caulk that you see at the top of the old baseboards. Go deep enough to get through all the caulk. You can also use a putty knife to get a little deeper behind the baseboards in case they're being stubborn or they're held on by any kind of additional adhesives. And if you don't work all the adhesive and all the caulk loose, you're going to end up damaging the drywall. It's going to actually pull some of that paper off the drywall and pull those as you're pulling those baseboards off the wall.
Yep. Now, if that happens, don't worry. You can repair those spots later before installing the new baseboards. But that's just an extra step you can easily avoid. If your baseboards have quarter round at the bottom, you'll obviously need to remove those as well and replace those at the end. Now, our room doesn't have any, so we didn't have to worry about that. One more tip: get yourself some knee pads for this project. Your knees will thank you later, and you'll thank us, trust us, because we tried doing some of this without knee pads. It wasn't a lot of fun. Those knee pads make a huge difference on your knees, and you're going to be on your knees throughout this process. It really does help.
Now next, you're going to pry off all your baseboards. Starting on an outside corner, work to slowly insert the flat edge of the pry bar or the molding removal tool between the baseboard and the wall. If you find it hard to get started, you can gently tap the tool with a hammer to create a gap between the baseboard and the wall.
Place a small piece of wood behind the pry bar against the wall as you work the baseboards loose. This will help prevent damage to the walls by distributing the force of the tool across a larger surface of wall, preventing dents and punctures.
Now, carefully pry the baseboard. Continue to work your way around the room using the pry bar and slowly and carefully pry the baseboards away from the wall. Working along the length of the baseboard, insert the pry bar every few inches.
Then you want to loosen the nails. As you pry these baseboards loose, you'll find that they're usually attached with nails and adhesive, and if the nails are present, use the pry bar to loosen them from the wall. Most should be driven into wall studs and will be a little bit harder to remove than any that you find that are maybe just driven into the drywall itself.
Now, if some are stubborn or you find patches of adhesive, try to score through that with your utility knife or your putty knife and try to avoid damaging that drywall.
Take note of where the nails are located in your wall studs and mark their locations with painter's tape. To ensure your new baseboards are installed securely, you want them attached to studs as much as possible. If you are unsure, you can use a stud finder to identify and mark the location of the studs.
You'll need to do this eventually anyway, so it's a good idea to identify them now. Once the baseboard is sufficiently loosened, carefully pull it away from the wall and remove it. You can hold on to those and use them when cutting your baseboards. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second.
Now, if you do decide to discard all of your old baseboards at this point, just be sure and check with your local trash collectors for specifics on how to do that. You may not be able to just leave them out with your garbage the way they are, like big long pieces of baseboard. What you're probably going to want to do is cut them up into small pieces and just put them in garbage bags and put those in your can. They're more likely to pick those up if you do it that way. Remove any leftover nails with pliers. If you find that you can't get a nail pulled out, you've got a couple of options. You can just cut it flush with the wall and kind of leave it there. You can also use a nail set to kind of push it all the way into the wall so you don't see it anymore.
This will be covered up by the new baseboard. Now here's a tip that we just referenced, Mike. You can use those old baseboards as templates. Not only can you practice cutting with them, but you can also use them by marking them and labeling them in conjunction with your diagram. Then you can take those old baseboards over to your saw. You can actually put them on your saw and use them as a guide as you work your way around the room.
You know, when I think about this, when I was a kid, I know people don't do this as much anymore, but when I was a kid, my mom made a lot of our clothes, and she always had these patterns, you know, and you have a piece for the side of the shirt, and you have that, and you connect it to the material, and you cut out the material. But as you're looking at the old piece, you can just confirm that you're making the exact same kinds of cuts on the new piece. So it's really just a template, kind of a pattern to have there with you to make sure that your angles are the same, because you can get a little confused on the angles when you're doing this. So it's just like just something to have there to make sure that you are clear on where you're headed with your cuts. So you can simply reference them as you're cutting the new baseboards to make sure that you're making the right angled cuts at the ends of each piece. This can really help you kind of stay on track and avoid any confusion when you're making your cuts. You'll be making a lot of them, and getting confused can be normal. So this will definitely kind of help avoid that. Another tip, look on the back of the pieces. There's a good chance that the contractor that installed them initially did what we're asking you to do. They may have labeled them. They may have made their measurements on the back. Now, it might have been a long time ago. It might be faded. It might be hard to read, but it's worth a try just to kind of check to see, just to double check that, hey, this measurement's already here and it's the same as what I measured. It's just another checkpoint to make sure that you're on track.
Now, I just want you to think of it as puzzle pieces. You're using them to create new pieces and ensuring that they match the old ones.
Yep. Now, it's time to inspect and kind of clean up after you removed all that stuff. Once all the baseboards have been cleared away, inspect the wall for any damage. Clean the wall surface where the baseboards were attached, removing any debris or old caulk and adhesives. You can do this with a scraper or a putty knife. Repair the wall, any kind of damage that's needed with spackle, let that dry, sand it, and smooth it off.
Now, it's important to remember, Mike, this doesn't have to be perfect. Remember, it's going to be covered up by the new baseboards. You just don't want any bumps to interfere with the new baseboards laying flat against the wall.
Now you want to measure your angles. Before cutting any baseboards, you need to first measure the angles of all your corners. You may want to start with a hidden corner, possibly maybe behind a door or inside a closet, in case the baseboards in that space end up not being quite perfect. You really won't see that corner that often, so small mistakes aren't as much of a concern there, and you're going to get better as you go along. So starting in a corner that you don't see very often, for the measuring, for the cutting, and the installing, is probably a good way to go, because again, if you make a small mistake, you're not going to see that much, and you're going to get better as you go.
Now, use an angle finder to measure the angle of the inside corner where the baseboard will be installed. Then proceed by measuring all the corners both inside and outside and transferring those measurements to your room diagram. That way you can reference this anytime you get stuck or confused about what's needed throughout that install.
Now let's talk a little bit, Ron, about the 90 degrees that you hope all of your corners are. When you use the angle finder and you put it against the wall, it's going to tell you what the degree total is for that corner. In most cases, hopefully it's 90 degrees. If it is, you simply divide the 90 degrees in half. That means that each half of that corner is 45 degrees. So those are the cuts that you're going to need. When you go to make your angled cuts on the two pieces that are going to meet on either an inside or an outside corner, each half needs to be half of whatever that corner is. So again, if it's 90 degrees, each cut is going to be a 45 degree cut. When you put them together they make the 90 degree corner.
Now, it's not so much a big deal when we're thinking about that inside corner, because inside corners are kind of easily, cleaned up with a little caulk, a little wood filler.
And they're kind of hidden in a corner. They're not protruding like an outside corner.
That's right. It's the outside corners that you want to be real particular about, because you want a real tight miter. And how you get that, use that angle finder. And like Mike said, if it's 91 degrees, well, then you can angle it and make sure that you have that right half that you're going to need in order to make that miter fit tight.
So I was just going to say, what do you do if it's not quite 90 degrees? Let's say your corner is 92 degrees. Then what do? You divide it in half.
That's right. So then, of course, that would be what, 46 degrees.
246 degrees.
That's right. And I guarantee you, if you cut it at 46 degrees, one side and the other side, and you lay it on there, it's going to fit just like it was a 90-degree corner.
Right. And you'll see this later when we start making our cuts. Depending on the saw that you have, some may have more options for, different kinds of cuts than others. You want to just get as close as you can. If you get some weird angle and it's not an option, like the half of that corner isn't an option on your saw, you just want to get as close as you can. Like Ron said, you can always fill in that gap that's left with caulk at the end of the process, and you'll never know it's there. Once it's done and it's sanded and you paint it, nobody's ever going to know it's there. And these are small differences that we're talking about. These are little minute differences.
So now let's take a minute, Mike, to discuss the different cuts that they're going to be encountering whenever we're dealing with any type of molding project. You have the inside corner, the outside corner, and something called a scarf joint cut.
So let's talk about those. What is an outside corner?
An outside corner, of course, is going to be two outside cuts that are going to come together to form kind of like a little pitch, and they're going to fit together on that outside corner. Now, the inside corner is going to be the reverse of that. It's going to be like that inside peak. Like if you have the outside peak and then you have the inside peak, that's exactly what the inside corner is going to be as well.
So just think of it this way, just a normal square room, all of those corners are inside corners. They're pointing inside into the corner of the room. Outside corners are the opposite of that. So think about if you've got a closet that jets out, or a fireplace, or some part of a wall that jets out. That outside corner that's pointing out away from the wall, that's an outside corner. If it's pointing into a corner, it's an inside corner.
I think about it like this too. You go around the corner, that's an outside corner.
Yes, that's true.
Something like that.
Or if you're misbehaving and you're told to stand in a corner,
that's the inside, corner.
Now, what about a scarf joint?
I'm real familiar with the inside corner.
I've spent a lot of time in corners.
So a scarf joint is when you take a piece of molding It can be any type of molding. It can be crown molding, baseboard molding, and you're going to run it. It's like a long run, and you don't have enough to finish off the wall. So you have got to take and put two pieces of molding together. They are typically two 45-degree cuts opposite that lay on top of each other. Real important to remember that you want to start a scarf joint cut on a stud and then finish the other one on top of it so the stud helps hold it together.
It is two cuts, it is a joint, but the cuts are going in the same direction because they're meeting on a flat surface, not in a corner. So it's a joint just like the other two, but they're cut a little bit differently and they're connected a little bit differently. But you can see how what the differences are as we show you these examples. But those are the three ones that exist, and the only ones you're going to have to deal with: inside corner, outside corner, and a scarf joint. Let's go back to the diagram of our room and talk about the different options for cuts depending on where these pieces of baseboards are going to be installed. So as you look at the diagram, this first piece here, this is a 33-inch piece. You'll notice that the edges are different. Here's why. The left-hand side of that piece of baseboard is meeting in a corner, and that's an inside corner. So there is going to be an inside angled cut on the left-hand side of that baseboard. The right-hand side is different. It's a straight cut. Why is that? It's not meeting in a corner. It's running up to the side of a door. That's the entrance to the room there, and there's case molding around the door, and that's going to be a straight edge. So that piece will be an angled cut on the left-hand side, but a straight cut on the side that meets that door. Right, now what about this one, Ron?
So that's just a butt-to-butt cut, believe it or not. It's just a straight cut, 0 degrees on one side and 0 degrees on the other. You're going to have that sometimes whenever you have like a door going into another door or something, a door casing into another door casing.
Yeah. This next piece over here on the other side of the closet, that's kind of the opposite of that 33-inch piece. This is a 20.5-inch piece. It's a straight cut on the left side, but it's an angled cut on the right side because it's meeting in that corner. Now, what about these two, Ron?
Those two are actually the other ends of those corners. So that's actually going to be an outside cut. Then on the other end are going to be inside cuts that are going to be kind of like going into that corner.
So as you look through these, just think about where it's going in the room and what it's meeting, because that's the other thing that's going to determine the cut is not only where it goes, but what it's bumping up against. What about this one, Ron, in the back of the room?
It's going to be two inside corner cuts. So remember, those long pieces, if they're in a corner, you're going to have an inside left and an inside right. It's going to have to meet into another piece of molding. So for inside corners, you're going to measure and mark the back side that rests against the wall. But the back side will be slightly longer than the front side for these cuts.
For outside corners, you also mark your boards on the wall side of the baseboard. But in these cuts, the wall side of the baseboard will be slightly shorter than the front side. Be aware of this as you're planning out your cuts.
So here's a few tips before you start cutting. For this, in any project requiring cutting wood, the tip is to simply cut those baseboards a little long. That way, you can walk the cut back and trim it as needed so that you can get that perfect fit. Instead of trying to be perfect the first time, and then you end up cutting it a little short, and now you can't use that piece of wood for that particular wall.
Right, because you can always shorten a cut, but you can't obviously lengthen a board if it's been cut too short. So this also helps account for the thickness of the blade, which can throw off your cuts as well.
That's right. And the average kerf on a blade is about 1/8 of an inch. Now think about that for a second. If you take the mark with your blade, then you are 1/8 of an inch short.
You're automatically shorter than you need it to be. Right.
But it's also depending on which side of the miter saw that you're on.
Right. And so think about that. If you cut a little bit extra and the blade takes off the little bit of extra, it might be perfect. But you always want to err on the side of being extra long because you can shorten it. But you don't want to be on the short side of the mark because then it's automatically too short. It's not going to fit. You got to start all over and you've wasted that piece of baseboard.
Now, I'm an advocate for this next tip. Consider painting those baseboards first, letting them dry before you start making those cuts. Having them painted on the front end means that you only need to do touch-ups after you install. And this is done a lot quicker and a lot less messy than if you had to paint them while they're actually already installed.
Yeah, a lot of people won't think about this. They'll think, well, I'm going to be carrying them and installing them. I'm going to mess them up. Yes, but the little marks that you might make on installation, those are little spots. You can always fix those. You can always paint over those little places later on, as opposed to painting the whole thing. Not to mention, it's a lot easier to paint the baseboards up on a sawhorse or something, standing up, quickly painting them, as opposed to installing them and then getting back on your knees. You've been on your knees the entire time you've been doing this and doing the painting while they're in place. Not only is it tougher to do, it's bad on your back, it's bad on your knees, but you also risk getting paint on your carpet, on your hardwood, on your wall. The more paint you can do on the front end, the less messy it's going to be on the back end. It's going to save you some time and a lot of frustration. Now, to be safe, you should never wear gloves when cutting with a power saw. You should always wear eye and ear protection and a face mask to prevent breathing in the dust from the saw, especially if you're using MDF baseboards, as they create a really fine dust that flies everywhere. You don't want to breathe that.
Now, it's also a good idea to double check your measurements again before making your cuts. Check to make sure the measurements that you've noted on your diagram are accurate and that you use the diagram as a reminder when cutting your baseboards.
It really is a map. It's going to help you because, especially for folks who have never done this, it's a lot of angles, it's a lot of measurements, it's a lot. And it's easy to get kind of confused and lost. So having that diagram of the room, making as many notes as you need. You can write as many things as you want on there. Not only the measurements like we showed you on the diagram, but the angled cuts. Once you decide what they are, you can add those on there and just use that as a roadmap throughout the process. It's really going to make a difference. Now, pros and contractors tend to cut all of their baseboards at the same time and then install them all at the same time. But they're experienced. They're less likely to make mistakes. We suggest first-time DIYers cut and install baseboards one or two at a time. That way, if you make mistakes, you can learn from them and avoid making more of them. It will save you time and frustration, money, and baseboards. What you don't want to do is make a mistake and repeat that mistake 20 times and then discover it when you're trying to install them. You've wasted all the baseboard. So if you've never done it, do a couple at a time. The more confident you get, you can maybe pick up the pace and do more at a time later on. But starting out, at least, start just doing one wall, one baseboard at a time.
Absolutely. Now it's time to start cutting your baseboards. Using a miter saw or a hand saw and a miter box, don't necessarily recommend it, because miter saws are going to cut much faster, much cleaner than that manual miter box and hand saws. When doing trim work, always use a blade with about 60 to 100 teeth. The more teeth on the blade, the cleaner the cut.
Now, real quick, let's talk about, grab that miter box real quick. Now, if you don't have a miter saw, that's fine. You can always rent one because it's going to save you a lot of frustration and time. It's easier to use, it's quicker, and the cuts are much, much cleaner. And the tool is doing all of the work. If you're trying to use this, there are different angles on here, as you can see, but this is a manual saw. You can put your baseboard in there. You can find the angle that you need. You can change these angles based on what you're doing, but you're sawing those baseboards one by one. Fine to do that. Two things. It's going to wear you out because it's very physical. There's also, you're limited on the angles on these things. You're not going to be able to do those little fine adjustments that we talked about if you find that a corner is a little bit off. So perfectly fine if you don't have a miter saw, don't want to use a miter saw, you're intimidated by it, or you don't want to rent one. But this is going to be a lot more physical. It's going to take more time, and you're not going to be as accurate or as smooth as you would be on a miter saw.
In addition to that, Mike, using a miter box, you're fairly limited on the size and the scope of your project as far as how big the baseboard is.
Now, again, like we said, if you don't have a power miter saw, you can rent one at your local Home Depot store at the tool rental department. You just want to mark the lengths and cut the angles on the baseboards at both ends using a pencil and a square. You can even make notes to yourself, again, on the backs of the boards if needed. Just the more notes you need, the more notes you can do. It's fine to do that. Anything that helps you stay organized with your cuts and aware of which cuts you're making for each piece of baseboard.
So next, transfer the angle of the cuts needed for your first corner to the miter saw. Again, the angle you measured in the corner where you started dividing by 2 will tell you the angle at which your 2 baseboards will need to be cut to properly align in the corner. Any 2 angled cuts in the corner must add up to the total angle measurement for that corner.
And Ron, let's talk a little bit about the limitations on miter saws, because not all power miter saws are the same. There are limitations. Talk a little bit about what people might run into depending on the miter saw that they have.
Okay, first of all, depending on the budget, all right, if you own a miter saw, most miter saws can be anywhere from 7.5-inch blade, 10-inch blade, to up to a 12-inch blade. The bigger the blade, the bigger a piece of lumber that you can cut. The next thing to consider is whether or not your miter saw bevels back and forth. Most just single bevel to the left, which means that if you're cutting a large piece of baseboard, you may have to flip things over. You're going to see a little bit of that. Okay, now all miter saws are going to move to the left and move to the right when cutting something vertically. It's the laying flat cuts that require a beveled cut. So those are things to consider too. Another thing to think about is, does it have like a laser kind of like line so you can see your cut line and put that laser right on it, so that way you know exactly where you're cutting.
So this is the part of doing any kind of molding project that kind of gets people stumped a little bit. It's the most complicated thing, whether it's baseboards or crown molding, any kind of molding. It's these cuts, these angled cuts. Now, based on what Ron just said, if you've got a miter saw that only angles to the left, that's fine if you need a cut going this way. It aligns with the saw, right? But what if you need a cut going this way? Your saw doesn't go over there. It won't make that cut. What do you have to do? Since you can't make the saw adjust to this, you've got to adjust the baseboard. So Ron, talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so first of all, understand this. If you're cutting something extremely large, like we were using a 5.25-inch baseboard, so I was unable to cut that in a vertical fashion. I had to lay it flat. And because I had to lay it flat, I had to use the bevel of the saw, because it would not cut all the way through the large baseboard in a vertical fashion. Now, if you have a smaller piece of baseboard, if you got 3.5 or something along those lines, you can lay it up against the fence and use the bevel, use the miter to go left and right, and you don't have to flip it over if it's a smaller piece of baseboard or smaller piece of molding. But if it's larger than, say, 5.25, when you have to lay it flat and use the bevel, once you do that, it only is going to bevel to the left. So what does that mean? The molding on the left-hand side is going to be an inside corner cut, right? And the molding on the right-hand side of the cut, as we're looking at it, is going to be an outside corner cut, right? Now think about what that cut is. That's going to be an inside left corner on the left-hand side of the saw, and an outside right corner on the right-hand side of the saw. Now, to get that match or the mate to that cut, you're going to have to flip the baseboard around and backwards and make that same cut.
So if you can visualize it, again, if you need an angled cut like this and your saw goes that way, that's fine. But remember, this is the saw, this is the cut. If you want to cut this way, the saw won't go there. But if you flip your baseboard over, guess what? This cut now does align with the saw. I'm all over the place, but I hope that makes sense. You know, you want to cut like this, the saw goes like that. If you need a cut like this, you can't move the saw. You can move the baseboard to match the alignment. To make this simpler, don't get so caught up in all of that, because that can be very confusing. Again, keep track of what you need your cut to look like, and figure out how to get that cut on that saw. Regardless of the limitations, whatever you have to do to make your saw make that cut, keep your diagram in front of you and keep track of what your cut needs to look like. Finagle the baseboard to make sure that whatever the saw can and can't do, you make that cut regardless of what you're limited on.
At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, make templates. We suggested it previously. Make templates, label the templates. When you know that's what you need in that corner, bring that template to the saw, just like we say, bring that old baseboard. If the baseboard was ruined because it broken up whenever you took it off, get templates off the product that you have, and that way you're going to know exactly what you need. Okay, so whenever you're doing like a vertical cut, what I mean by that is it's standing up. It's literally standing up. This is an arbor. So this is what actually holds the blade on. Now this is a 10-inch saw. I'm limited to from here to here for the size that I can cut, or else it's going to hit this.
Right.
It's going to hit this and I can't make the cut. That's why I couldn't do a straight up and down cut like I typically would for a piece of baseboard, because my baseboard was bigger.
So in other words, as long as your baseboard is this big or smaller, you're fine. But if your baseboard is bigger, that's when you're going to start running into that.
That's absolutely correct.
Yep. So again, I know that's kind of confusing. It's a lot, but once you're in front of the saw and you've got your baseboards and you're thinking through your cuts, you'll be able to figure it out. You just got to keep track of what the angle needs to be. Do whatever you got to do to get that angle on your board. But that's going to be the thing that kind of helps you through this, just focusing on the cut and what you need to do. Now, as you go through this cutting process, just take your time and double check your measurements and your angles to avoid costly mistakes. Again, you've got some extra, but there's a limit, so you want to be careful as you make these cuts.
So it's super important to use a sharp saw blade to ensure clean and precise cuts, especially when working with delicate molding like baseboard.
We're going to start our installation on the left-hand side of our closet, which will require 5 separate pieces of new baseboard. In this corner, the baseboard to the left on the side of the closet door will have a straight cut on the side that butts up against the door casing and an angled inside corner cut where it meets in the corner. So we cut that piece and do a dry fit.
Now, since our miter saw cuts are tight and fit properly, we install this first piece of baseboard. We use a nail gun and finishing nails to secure the baseboard to the wall and place 2 nails every 12 to 16 inches at the top and the bottom of the bigger flat area of the baseboard along the length of the entire baseboard, driving them at a slight angle into the wall studs.
The next piece will have 2 inside corner cuts because both ends line up on an inside corner. Both cuts are angled inwards toward the inside of the closet. It will meet and align with the first baseboard we just installed. We cut that second piece, dry fit it, and install it, aligning our nails with the marked studs.
Next, after confirming our measurements for the longer back wall of the closet, we make our 2 inside corner cuts. This third baseboard will meet the second piece with a right inside corner cut and end with the other corner with a left inside corner cut.
We cut and dry fit that piece in place and then begin securing it with our nails to the studs along the wall.
So we ran into a small but common issue with our fourth piece. It was measured dead on correctly, but we struggled getting it into place because of a slight imperfection in the drywall next to the right side. You may run into this, so you can either try to slide it in from above, which we could not do, or you could just shorten it a bit to make it fit.
If this happens, you can fix the small gap left from the extra cut when you caulk the corners at the end of your install. This baseboard met our third piece and had 2 inside corner cuts. Now our fifth and final closet piece met the fourth piece with a right inside corner where they met in the corner and another straight edge that butted into the closet door casing.
Next, we move to the wall just outside the closet. We install the 20-inch piece of baseboard on the first wall, which needs a straight cut next to the closet door casing and a corner cut. Then we move to the bump out next to it. It requires 2 pieces cut for an outside corner. The first piece needs an inside right corner cut and an outside left corner cut, and will meet the baseboard at the closet wall. The opposite end requires an outside left corner cut.
Now we have measured the angle of the outside corner and found it to be 90 degrees. So again, the outside corner needs 2 simple 45-degree cuts. So we adjust the miter saw to the 45-degree measured angle, ensure the blade is aligned with the marked cut lines, and make our cut. When making outside corner joint connections, you can use wood glue on both corner cuts.
This will help ensure that your mitered corners are less likely to separate. Then we proceeded by nailing them into place. Then we move on to one of the large walls in the room. In our installation, we did not require any cuts in those baseboards since all three longer walls were less than 16 feet. If that's not the case in your project and you have a wall longer than 16 feet, you will need to have 2 scarf cut pieces of baseboard that will cover the length of the wall.
Again, scarf joints are needed when connecting 2 pieces of baseboard on a flat wall and not in a corner. When you do this, always align your scarf joints at a wall stud so the joint can be secured into the stud where the 2 pieces meet. The lengths of each piece can vary, but try to make them as even as you can.
Once you've confirmed your measurements and decided where your scarf joint seam will be, make your cuts and do a dry fit before installing the 2 baseboards. Now you're going to want to add some glue. Using glue mic in the corners or in any type of joint is going to be always a plus. But make sure that you remove any excess glue that comes out of the joint.
Right, and we talked a little bit about glue on an outside corner being really important. You can use glue on any connection. It's not required, but it's always a good idea. It's just going to make it more secure. So definitely on outside corners, probably on inside and scarf joints as well. So we suggest doing it on all of them just to make sure that, your house is going to settle, things are going to move a bit. Those joints can start to pop loose a little bit. That wood glue can help prevent that over time.
Yeah, it comes down to expansion and contraction. So when it gets cold, things are going to contract. When it gets warm, things are going to expand. So the glue helps keep that in check.
Right. Now, you're going to repeat this basic process that we've gone through throughout the room. Checking your measurements, making your cuts, dry fitting your baseboard to ensure the lengths are accurate, and installing them. Work your way around the room, installing your baseboards one section at a time.
Once all the baseboards are installed, fill any nail holes with wood filler or putty. Allow that filler to dry and sand smooth with a fine grit sandpaper.
Place painter's tape on the wall at the top edge of the baseboard. This will ensure that no caulk gets on your wall.
Apply your caulk using one continuous smooth bead. Apply that bead of painter's caulk along the top edges and the inside and the outside corners of each baseboard to fill any gaps between the baseboard and the wall or the floor.
Now, touch-up paint. You want to touch up any caulked nail hole and paint the baseboards to ensure a seamless finish. Since we're working on carpet, we want to use our putty knife to push a plastic wrap or a plastic drop cloth under the baseboard. Doing this will ensure that we get no paint on the carpet.
So there's some other tips to tell you. It's often helpful to make sure that you take some test cuts on scrap pieces of baseboard to ensure accuracy of the measurements and or the adjustments before cutting the actual baseboard.
Take your time and double check your measurements and angles to avoid costly mistakes.
Use that sharp saw blade, like I said before, to ensure those clean and precise cuts, especially when working with molding like baseboard.
Mark the angles on your baseboards using a pencil and a square, ensuring the mark is on the side of the board that will be cut away. That accounts for that extra part that we've talked about. Mark the waste piece with an X just to keep yourself straight.
Carefully align the blade of the miter saw or the saw guide of the miter box with the marked angle.
How to install baseboards when the floor is not level. You've got a couple of things that you can do. Sometimes your floor, just like your walls, aren't exactly level. What are some of the things that we can do?
Well, the first thing we can do is we can shim it. So if the floor is significantly uneven, you may need to use shims to level the baseboards. Place the shims underneath the baseboard when necessary to ensure that they sit level on the floor. Use a level to make sure that the baseboard is straight vertically as you nail it in place. Now keep this in mind, when you do that, you're going to probably need to use some kind of quarter round or shoe molding because you're going to see a gap underneath that baseboard, and that is because you have that uneven floor or that bump or hump in the floor.
Now, another option you have is scribing. What is that? In cases where the floor varies in height along the length of the wall, you may need to scribe the bottom of the baseboard to match that contour on the floor. This involves tracing the irregularities of the floor onto the baseboard and carefully cutting along that line to make the bottom of the baseboard that used to be straight now not straight to align with the floor, which is also not straight.
Now, flexible caulk, you're going to use that to hide any gaps between the baseboard and the floor caused by that unevenness. Mike brought that up earlier. You can use that flexible caulk by applying a bead of that caulk along the bottom edge of the baseboard before painting it to create a seamless finish.
Now, here are the tools that you'll need for this project. We've shown them, but we haven't really talked about and listed them out.
So that's about it for this workshop on cutting and installing baseboards. Here's what we've covered: measuring and planning, preparing the work area, removing those old baseboards, planning for your cuts, cutting your baseboards, installing, and then those final touches that will make that room pop.
But with that, we will wrap up this workshop. So for myself, Ron, and the entire Home Depot How-To Workshop team, thanks for joining us today. Good luck with your project. And as always, thanks for shopping at the Home Depot.